Welcome. This morning we have 3 speakers. I'm going to let them introduce themselves. I spent a lot of time reading through their bios, and I thought I'm probably going to get into trouble if I miss out some key things, and so I'd like them to tell you what they think is most important about their really distinguished backgrounds. They're all senior lecturers. We have Professor Andreoni, and he's from SOAS in London. We have Dr. Kenneth Creamer, who is famously local at WITS. And we have Reza Daniels, who's at UCT, all PhDs and really some respectable journal writings and work has been done in the field of economics in different spheres. So I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself, starting with Professor Andreoni.
Oh yeah, well, my name is Antonio. I teach at SOAS, University of London, and I'm also working with colleagues there on a project on anti-corruption across Africa. We are working in Nigeria, Tanzania. I spend lots of my time here. I'm originally Italian, but I spend more time in my home country. And I'm working also in Bangladesh. I also have an affiliation here at the University of Johannesburg in the chair, SACCI chair, which is one of the organizers of this event. And I've been working actually here with government as well over the years on a several number of projects, and I will eventually mention some of them later. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Welcome. Next, I'm going to ask Dr. Creamer to introduce himself.
That's my great-great-grandmother was from Napoli, but I've been in South Africa my whole life. I teach economics here at WITS University, and been supervising masters and some PhD students. But I've decided now to go and teach first year, and I'm quite inspired to look at reshaping the economics curriculum. That's, I think, why you invited me here. I'm also involved in economic policy issues, obsessively thinking about South Africa's economy, poverty, macroeconomic questions. So hopefully it will all come together. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And Reza Daniels.
Hi everyone, I'm at UCT. I am involved in a range of different projects there, one of which is the curriculum reform program, and I'm leading the chairing the undergrad curriculum reform committee there. In research, I work with Salvo. I'm one of the principal investigators on the National Income Study, and I've taught some of you the panel econometrics course this year. And then also I do more and more work in the field of environmental policy and pricing and different options for using it for costs. So it's a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Welcome. I'm quickly going to introduce CORE. Maybe if you can show by putting up your hand if you have heard of CORE before, if you have a decent idea of what it is. Okay, so almost half of us. A simple description of what CORE is, and please feel free to interject if you feel that I'm missing anything crucial, is it is an alternative introductory first-year economics curriculum. The authors, Margaret Stevens, or coordinators rather, there's an entire group of people involved in the project. Margaret Stevens, Samuel Bowles, and Wendy Carlin have come together to coordinate a project that allows an open access free curriculum to be made available. So you can log online, you can access a digital version of the curriculum, and the idea is that to both teachers and students, a new curriculum is made available. It's in response to being dissatisfied with the curriculum that's been taught in the past, and the idea is that they're not only challenging some fundamental ideas about economics, but they are making it free and available, and have a working group that adjusts the curriculum to specific markets. There's an Asian working group, for instance. In the past, there's been talk of having an African working group. There are about 82 universities around the world that are working with CORE at the moment. In South Africa, UP's taken the plunge, and they've launched it this year, and I know UCT is working on launching it. We're working on launching it here at WITS, along with a number of other campuses around the country. And so our question today is this fitting the gap that we've identified in economics curriculum? And the idea is, in our session, we want to be able to interrogate that question and to be able to answer it honestly. If there are gaps, where are those gaps? We invite questions from everybody on the floor. We want it to be an inclusive session today. So women, speak up. Your voice is welcome to be heard here. You might have your hand up first, but we want to be able to get some representation. Okay, so I'm going to ask Kenneth to start, if you would.
much. Welcome everybody here. I think Sherilyn and I have the same instinct just to introduce CORE a little bit for those who might not be familiar with it. And then I won't be talking for too long. I was told I could talk for 10 minutes or 15 minutes. So CORE stands for Curriculum Open Access Resources in Economics. It's reforming the teaching of economics, developing free, high-quality online resources. So all of you could register if you haven't for CORE by visiting the website, www.coreecon.org. You're a teacher, you register, or a student, and you get access immediately to this world-class development of an economics curriculum aimed at first year or entry-level students into economics. There is also a hard copy textbook published by the Oxford University Press version of the book, and there's contributors from all over the world honing the different topics in that course, drawn together with the philosophy that we should be teaching economics in a new way, and we should be doing economics as if the recent crises have happened. The basic units are listed here. Many of you will be familiar with that. There's the cover of the textbook up there. It goes through 22 units: capitalist revolution, technological change, scarcity, social interactions, the labor market, economic fluctuations. And you can see immediately by looking at that, it's different from your normal first year text. It starts off with trying to root economic theory and thinking in a description of how the world has changed over the centuries in what is called the capitalist revolution. And then it deals with the topics accordingly. This is a useful slide that Sam Bowles and Wendy Collin also developed, and I think it just shows you some of the philosophical differences that exist between CORE and the more traditional materials. They characterize it as the benchmark model. Samuelson, as a young student, it was an anti-Samuelson textbook, so that was the CORE of the 1980s. But Samuelson, being the text that tried to simplify economics and became a standard way of teaching economics in America and throughout the world. So if you look at people, they assume that rational expectations are almost like computers that are able to calculate their interest or the utility function, far-sighted, self-interested. CORE begins to allow for behavioral issues and cognitive limitations and tries to embed that into how we model people's decisions in the economy. The baseline model was based on price takers and perfect competition, but the idea of not being too simplistic and allowing students from the very beginning to understand that there are institutions, there's power, there's price, there's firms of pricing power. There might be, how do we model their role as price makers in a whole range of markets, whether it's wage setting or other prices. Information assumed to be complete, no. There's asymmetries in information, incomplete notions, and etc., etc. History is taken into account, differences amongst people, power, economic variance, stability. So whereas the capitalist system is regarded as self-stabilizing, we should rather look at it as something that is inherently unstable. And whether you use that in a Marxist sense to bring down the system, or whether in a Keynesian sense you stabilize the system, you understand that there is instability in this, and you model around that. CORE can assist with rethinking economics in a number of ways. What I like about it is it synthesizes. I've become very pragmatic and eclectic, and it seems to, it's not very ideological in that sense, where it says we only in this side, or we prefer that side. It tries to synthesize the thinking from a range of theorists, whether it's game theory, whether it's insights around Friedman on inflation and money supply, whether it's Marxism, Keynes, and even Minsky, and issues like that. It starts to say, well, look, our students mustn't have an ideological straitjacket. They need to be able to synthesize the best of, and it's not a comparative. I mean, we've all studied, or many of us, comparative economics. This economist said that, this economist said that, they're different, and it leaves you feeling like you can describe what different economists say, or different schools of thought say. It does attempt to leave you with a core, to coin a phrase, of economic tools that are drawn from different schools, and which can help you to answer the questions that you face as an economist, rather than you can teach people to critique neoliberalism or neoclassicism, and then that's not the whole of economics. And first you need to understand the different schools and then apply them differently. So it's quite, I think in that sense for me, it's got an intellectual superiority to its contribution, where it tries to give the students that wider understanding from different schools of thought and synthesize them into some useful toolkit of analysis. It tries to move away from narrowness and weaknesses in economics. One of the slogans was teaching economics as if the last 10 years happened. Which sounds simple, but it's a very profound idea. There's a Southern African or African edition of CORE, which would be essential. The organizers asked the question here, these are the universities that it's at. The topic is CORE the alternative? I would say a better question would be, can we use CORE to improve the way we teach economics in South Africa? Can we use CORE to develop an economics curriculum that empowers our students with the right tools? Will CORE assist us in producing economists who can play a transformative role and help them to break out of the straitjackets? So we kind of have a situation where our economists, when you look at your young economists in your class, there's two errors they could make. They could just fall into the straitjacket of kind of traditional economics. They could have explaining models, even if the models are not good at explaining the world, and they get good marks for that. Or they fall into this populist economics, it's not good, we just can change everything, and it can lead to a dead end in policy making as well. And we have to steer them between those two lines, and I think CORE is quite helpful in that as well. So it's not a silver bullet or a cure-all. I think it could be a useful framework for getting our young economists thinking correctly, and that's what inspires me. And it's, for example, next year at WITS, we're going to be piloting some of this material for our first year students. And the way we're doing it is we're going to take some of the materials, like the capitalist revolution, technology, population growth, inequality, property and power, redistribution policy, politics and public policy, climate change, and the nation and the world economy, using very, very useful paradigms for discussing globalization and how it engages its limitations. And those topics wouldn't have been taught to our students next year if we didn't start introducing that. And we're going to pilot that. There was a feeling that we need to make sure that that we pitch it correctly for our students. That the work is dense, it can be difficult, but I believe if it's taught well to first year students, even in our context, with our education challenges, they will be able to start engaging with these topics, which are seen to be like PhD level discussions. But no, I think from the beginning, the first year students must start to engage with the complexities of economics, rather than making it too simple or dumbing it down in a way that is not useful. And I really believe in the power of relevant case studies. So in addition, I've got a kind of an agenda with CORE, which many of us do. It's not good enough to just take CORE from the West, the US CORE, or obviously the European CORE, the UK CORE. We need to do what I hear is being done in Latin America, South Asia, where we develop relevant case studies and context. So there must be an edition which is based in our Southern African realities, looks at our unemployment data, looks at our balance of payments data, looks at our budgetary position. And I think really, just to sum up and end, if we can get our students to be able to understand things in our context, that's a very powerful pedagogical, didactic tool. You can see when you're looking at your students, if you're telling them about the US balance of payments or whatever, it's not, or the Fed, you rather talk about the South African Reserve Bank. If we cut interest rates today, because we need, our economy needs what do they call it? A stimulus. We are in recession, and we cut interest rates today. Is that the correct policy? First year students discussing macroeconomics must be able to answer that. And I can see all of you have got a different opinion. I've got a very strong opinion on it. And then if you understand, will that be an expansionary policy, or will it be a contractionary policy? If you know the difference between appearance and reality, you will know it might appear to be expansionary, but the consequences are likely to be contractionary, the reality. Because as soon as you drop the interest rates by 2%, as some people are asking us to do, you will, in the context of a very weak currency, you will increase inflationary expectations. And the term structure of interest rates will immediately respond. And the cost of investment will immediately be higher. And the cost of investment and jobs will contract. And it's just those kind of questions. If you discuss it in the context of our stimulus package, that issue, it's much more powerful, it's much more interesting. And that's what I want CORE to do. I think philosophically CORE is world class. It's globally the way that we as South Africans need to be part of that. But we need to contextualize it in our own, decolonize it, to use the phrase, and apply it correctly. Thank you very much.
I'm going to ask Professor Andreoni to speak next.
Okay. Hello everyone again. I think I will give you a different and more critical perspective about what CORE is about. And I'll do that building on not just my own experience and my own thinking, but also the work we've been doing with a parallel project, which actually started before, funded by ANET as well, which was the Skidelski reform curriculum. And I've been involved with not just Robert Skidelski, but also Jun Chang and others, also the Rethinking Economics UK and Reteaching Economics UK, so different constituencies, different groups, in looking at what CORE was and how that was reflecting to a certain extent what the students were telling us wanted to hear, and what also from our perspective was what could become a real pluralist training in economics. And I would say I don't want to put I don't want to be too negative, but I think we need to be careful about looking at what CORE is about. Because I think you get a very good overview, and in terms of the coverage of the topics, everything might look like we are actually getting something very new. The reality, when you start looking at specific chapters and specific issues, you start wondering if we are really providing a pluralist perspective, or in fact we are integrating a number of ideas which are coming, if you want, from all the advancement in information economics, behavioral economics, and so on, or the sort of rediscovery of some of the macro post-Keynesian type of ideas, or to use the Robinson expression, if you are using a bastardized Keynesianism, or we are talking about behavioral economics, but we are doing still that within a pretty much individualistic framework of what Seth used to call the rational fools. Now, the idea is that I don't have time to go deeper into each of these issues, but I want to go through 5 main points and then leave the space for the discussion and try to provoke your thinking about also what this very beautiful title is about, right? Economics for Africa, right? So I think there is also something specific about Africa, or better, the different African countries, about what economics can do for them. So the first point I would like to discuss with you is the following. Economic ideas are not curiosities or boxes with pictures of dead economists. Ideas come from history and shape history. What I mean with that, if you open CORE, it's true, we have now interesting reference to this funny guy called Adam Smith, who, never had a chair in economics, he had a chair in moral science. He always thought that his most important book was not The Wealth of Nations. It was, in fact, you know what? The Theory of Moral Sentiments. What a bizarre title for someone who is supposed to be the founder of economics. He was interested about fellow feelings, sympathy, rationality, all these type of things in a quite complex social theory. Okay? Definitely we are in a situation now where if someone opens a CORE textbook, they start learning that these people are there. There was in history, that there were some ideas around. But economists like Schumpeter used to say, we need to understand the history of economic analysis, which is different from saying, we know that these people at some point were saying ideas, and sometimes we even don't remember exactly what their ideas were. Think about how the concept of comparative advantage has been, from the old Ricardo, has been transformed in something which doesn't really, in the so-called Echelon-Samuelson model, doesn't really reflect some of the technological hypotheses that Ricardo himself put in place. Now, this is the first problem, right? You have just an idea that there are these people, but you don't really know where this idea came from. Why these people were all looking, Marx, Ricardo, Smith, and so on. Why they were looking at issues around industrialization. Why they were obsessed with issues around trade, rents, land, and so on. Because economists, when they do their job, they are looking at reality. They are looking at what is the fundamental issues around them. And for some time, we had a bunch of economists who had not been doing their job. So they've been basically looking at something else, right? And that's the problem of missing 10 years of crisis and, long years of crisis, in fact, not just the last 10, probably a much longer period. So this is my first point. We need to understand where ideas come from, in what historical context they've been shaped, and how they've been linked to the more ideological and more fundamental, if you want, philosophical, political perspective that were dominant in each point in time. And I think this is a much more deeper way of thinking about the fact that we have not a science that developed in a cumulative way, and so we can just read the last 5 years paper, we got the best, or eventually we just get 10, 15 years of the last integration in economics, and then we got the full story. That's not the case. At the same time, it's difficult. We don't want to have students in the first year getting like, okay, now I have to learn all these old people and how I'm going to deal with it. And there are different ways of doing it. So for example, in reteaching economics, we are trying to say, can we actually build up an understanding of these ideas looking at specific problems? So we are writing something which is going to be, has been funded by ANIT as well. Ajun Chan, myself, and another colleague from Cambridge, Jonathan Aldred, we've been working on what we call unsettled issues. A number of issues. For example, I'm sure many of you are curious about what robotics is about, and how robotics, to understand automation, we need really to understand what technologies are, where these things come from, and probably realize that these things have been around for 50 years, despite the fact that economists seem to discover them over the last 3-4 years and getting all scared about these things. The second point I would like to make is that as soon as we have a more deeper understanding, which I think is still missing, unfortunately, in core, of where ideas come from, how they are related to the history of cultures, societies, the structure of the different economies around the world, then we can also start understanding if there have been different paradigms in economics, right? And where we fit ourselves. Now, I would say, and here, I think if you are curious, you can read the book by Luigi Pasinetti, who is one of the last glorious Keynesians in Cambridge, still alive, who has been saying, in economics we have two main paradigms. These people have been there for 50 years, so they have quite a long perspective about what these things are about. And we have one paradigm which is around markets, which is around scarcity, which is around exchange. We study a lot about how these markets work, right? We study a lot about the problem of allocation of resources, because as we learn, economics is the science of scarcity, right? Of allocation of resources and so on. But we learn very little about how resources are created, who are the people involved in the creation of the resources, how organizations work, and more fundamentally the fact that this thing called the market doesn't exist. So the market is something that is socially constructed, is an institution, is something that, what you can have in the market or not have in the market is something which is determined by a certain type of historical phase. So Ajun in Cambridge uses always this Marxist example, right? In the 19th century, people were debating in the UK, should kids work 12 hours or 8 hours? These are potential workforce, right? So he could be working in the market, pricing, wages, blah, 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 right? No, but the point was that, if you are part of the market or not, if you can trade a product or not, is determined by how you shape the market, right? So this is a fundamental, I cannot develop this, now it's just provocation to start thinking about the fact that we need to put this thing in context, but not just simply referring to the fact that there are different countries. Great, we know that there are different countries, and what that means in terms of our analytics, our understanding of the ideas. And here I will be a bit straight to the point. I think one of the most fundamental fallacies of core, and I talk with people who have been involved, and some of them are also recognizing that, is that all economists have a specific perspective, right? And I'm happy to know some of the people who are involved in producing this, and you're right, it's an excellent, it's huge endeavor. But you can cluster these people around certain groups of school or way of thinking and so on. And I can feel a sort of bias, which is a bias of a macro perspective, and even in the case of Bowles, if you look at his excellent book, Microeconomics textbook from 2004, I think it was, production is not really there. What I mean with that? I mean that, especially if you look about Africa, I'm sorry, but we need to understand, and here I'm quoting a social scientist, a sociologist, Ricoeur, French sociologist, we need to understand the structures of living together, which means we need to understand how production is organized in different places, and how production can be the space in which lots of conflict emerge and lots of conflict can be solved. I'm very sorry to say, but I don't think we have that in core. And this is a big problem. People need to understand, I always tell my students, all the problems start in production, all the problems can be solved there. The reason is that if you look around the world, Herbert Simon had a beautiful picture. He said, if someone looks at from Mars and look at the world, right, and you paint all the market transaction in red, and all the other transactions within organization, productive organization, within institutions and so on in blue, what do you think is going to be the color of the world from Mars? Pretty much blue. And, well, but the point is that, pretty much purple, that would be a good way to put it. But, at the moment, we seem to look just at the red part, okay? So in that sort of pendulum, we should try to refocus our attention on how organization work. And productive organization, in that respect, are absolutely critical. I work in many applied projects. We have this project on anti-corruption, and I can tell you, we cannot understand corruption issues, political economy issues, we cannot understand all these problem, employment, unemployment issues, if we don't understand how different sectors operate, what are the conditions for employing people or not, what are the problems they've been facing in competitiveness around the world. And we need to have a theory which allows us to frame this problem in a non-standard market-focused type of perspective. I was mentioning this issue about working on corruption because, in a sense, not because we are obsessed with that topic. In fact, when we got the grant from DFID, we got £6 million. Great. From SOAS, because quite, this alternative bunch of people, why they get so much money? We got lots of money because organizations and governments realize that economists who are trained in the traditional way sometimes are pretty useless. In the sense that, if you want really to understand why there is corruption, you cannot just say, oh, people are very bad. People are not very bad. We are all pretty good and pretty bad in the same way. There is not a cultural issue. It's that I come from Italy, my country had corruption when we were developing. So probably we need to have a more nuanced understanding of what corruption means, what rents, as they are in the chapter there in core, really means in terms of the relationship between the state and the society. All the time the state makes a decision is allocating a rent. And this rent can be used in different ways, also in very productive ways. In fact, my own countries, in all countries, UK, Germany, we were all very much corrupted, and pretty much we are still there. But we use rents allocation, so rents capture, in a quite productive way. Okay? So, or we formalize that in a certain way. What I'm pointing to is that when you start looking beyond the market, you start looking at organizations, institutions, power in a profound sense, you realize that in fact the classical guys, the classical political economists, the classical development economists like Hirschman, like the Kaldor and so on, actually they got it quite right. Krugman said, they got all these ideas, but they couldn't formalize it with maths, right? That was the big problem. In fact, some of them had very sophisticated analytical tools to understand what development and underdevelopment was about. And in that set of tools, understanding the political economy was the key issue. I did my postdoc, my PhD in Cambridge, my postdoc in the engineering department, because I was very annoyed by the fact that the economists don't understand anything about technologies. But then you work with engineers, you realize, oh, well, great, now I understand that. But they don't understand anything about the economy and the political economy, right? But these two things are pretty much intertwined, right? You cannot understand why we have problems in this country, or why we have these macroeconomic issues. What is the micro behind that, right? What is the mesostructure behind it? And so we need to engage with these issues. And again, I'm playing this exercise as well, right? So I need to be provocative and I don't think core does that in a significant way. There are some references, there are some advancements, I could acknowledge that. But if we start discussing technology, I would rather discuss something around what technology historians like Nathan Rosenberg from Stanford have been teaching to evolutionary economists and so on. I'm on time. More than just giving them a very a poor idea of what the technology is of this, as Schumpeter used to say, what is that function that translates these factor inputs in certain ways. And why these things are relevant? Because all the time we design policies, if you are trained in a certain way, you might be unable to think out of that framework, which doesn't mean, and I agree with what you're saying, we jump on the other side, right? Everything becomes just a political struggle, we don't need any analytics and the fact, that's not the point. The point is to have a set of tools which allow us to engage with the complexity of the system. We are living in, which is becoming more complex because we have these different layers we have to understand. We need to understand the economics, we need to understand the political economy of that, we need to understand the organization, institutions, and so on. And this is the really challenging part. In interacting with students, very often, I think we underestimate how they understand some of these issues, right? So we provide them something which is supposed to be something that in the first year they can, right, access. So you, for example, you mentioned among the topic, I'm pleased that you picked one on the state, this issue around the nation in the world economy, right? So I don't know if it's the very last version, but this was when we were working with Rethinking Economics. A student of mine came and said, what do you think about this? You probably realized I'm a big fan of production issues and industrial policy. So there is a reason why the student came to me. And he said, do you think this is fine? I said, well, this is a problem. Because what they say here is that in explaining what protectionist policies are, is a limitation of trade, blah, 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 against foreign competition. We assume that there's competition from outside, or really competitive firms and so on, which affects consumers. And what about the fact that protectionism can be used actually to create jobs, and actually the so-called infant industry argument? Have you ever heard this argument? We need to understand why the Scottish Enlightenment was so in favor of trade at that point. The UK clearly didn't like the US developing their textile and their industries. So Hamilton said, forget it, we are going to build our manufacturers, because that's the way in which all countries in history, no one excluded, managed to build social wealth, create welfare state, and create this institution. Now, I would have liked to see much more of that, right? If we really say we want to understand history, we want to understand power, and we want to understand global issues, well, I think we need to engage with this topic in a much more serious way. The very last point is, many people think that, the challenge in teaching, I've been teaching microeconomics for some time, and the big challenge of, students have problems with all these functions and the maths and so on. I mean, to a certain extent, maths is very useful. But it's not what gives analytical rigor. You can have, you can use maths in a very consistent way to talk about nothing. Which is great. I mean, it's a beautiful exercise of style. Some people really like it, but they should do a different job, I would argue. The problem is that, as some people said before me, and by the way, people who are the founder of modern neoclassical economics, people like John Hicks, said this. You can read it by yourself. An economist no more than an economist is a danger for his fellow man. John Hicks was a quite calm person. I mean, he was not really revolutionary. He cannot be accused of these things. Economics is not a thing on its own, it's the study of an aspect of life in any society. Modern economic science is subject to a realist or Machiavellism. This was 1941. Okay? The treatment of social problems as mere technical issues and not as an aspect of the general quest for good life. Again, this doesn't mean that we don't need analytics. We need analytics because economics, there is lots of good common sense, but there is lots of complex things. That 10% of complex things that are not common sense are really complex, right? So analytics, sometimes math, sometimes different type of tools can be very useful, but they are not an end in itself. So I would really invite you all the time you have these very sophisticated models or people presenting very sophisticated analysis to challenge them in qualifying, defining exactly what these fancy variable they put there means and where the numbers come from and what they really, how do they check really what they, how do you calculate that productivity stuff? How the number was collected by the National Bureau of Statistics? Are you sure that the company was reporting that number? I do myself, my PhD student is here, we're working now on firm data in South Africa. We got the grant, and SARS is giving access to the data. Trust me, you can do lots of funny things with that. But there are lots of problems as well, right? So that is the analytical rigor, is the honesty of recognizing that we are dealing with a complex thing, and we have to, you know, be open about what are the problems and what we look at, how we do it, and so on and so forth. So my invitation is really to, I mean, in the 17th, 18th century, economics was, by some of these old guys, be defined the science of public happiness. If you read some pages from Pigou, right, he was telling his students, it's going to be hard, but you know, it's going to be rewarding because you can really change things. Not just jumping in the street saying, oh, this is all bad, but doing hard work, challenging your teachers in a fundamental way. And maybe that way we can start moving in that spectrum towards an alternative, which is never going to be one alternative. There are going to be different alternatives. That boundary is going to be moving. But please don't be, that's my selling point, don't accept the fact that there are new ways of saying we are offering something new. Yes, but we want something more, and you have to be able to articulate what is that more that you need. Thanks so much.
Thank you for that. I am encouraged at the quality of input. Next, Dr. Daniel. He doesn't have a presentation, but he's got some.
Thanks. So I want to start off by addressing what the question was directed to us as the presenters, which is core the alternative? And we're asking that question in the context of the Rethinking Economics for Africa Festival. And so my answer is very simple. Core isn't the alternative, so no. Core is an alternative. The question is, how do we utilize this new resource which not only revolutionizes access to a textbook, it makes it free, but it also introduces new textbook workshops, slides, it introduces calculus through an app, it introduces a whole lot of modern technological innovations that allow academics to be able to get into a certain amount of content in a new creative way and teach differently. You can entertain ideas of flipping the classroom more easily. You can teach a lot of applied data exercises in Excel, but you can also download R, the statistical package, and you can start teaching that from first year if you wanted to, right? So you revolutionize the ability to do applied research, and you can link it into each of the chapters where you can replicate the exact same graphs that are in the textbook. That has never been done before, right? And what that means from the pedagogy of how we teach economics, it revolutionizes that perhaps more than the content. Okay, so let's take a step back then. What does core enable us to do? The first 5 units of core build a foundation that enables one at a first year level to, by the end of those 5 units, look at the South African economy and say, okay, this is how it came about. And why does it do that? It does that because from a behavioral point of view, and core is grounded in behavioral economics, right? So it has its own ideological biases. associated with that. But with this behavioral focus, you then are able to look at power and institutions. You're able to look at a basic introduction to innovation in Unit 3 and 2, right? And you're able to see how people can capture those rents. Now, what's very interesting to me is I was previously sitting in the land debate, right? And there were vigorous debates about land and expropriation without compensation inside of South Africa. And it was packed with people, right, of all walks of life engaging on this question, because it's very important for all of us. If you use a combination of the first 5 units of core, you can understand almost every perspective in that entire room, from a socialist perspective all the way down through to a redistribute in a market-friendly way. And you can do that particularly in Unit 5, right? But it requires, so the tools of Unit 5 can be adapted to tell the South African story of land expropriation, colonization, right? And the new existential threat almost to a society if land expropriation without compensation proceeds in a careless way. Now, that to me is changing undergrad economics in a very fundamental way. And let's also remember that it's just first year and second year we're talking about. Core is not a substitute for an overall well-grounded economics curriculum that teaches all the sub-disciplines of economics, from finance to development to everything else. It's not a substitute for that, right? But core is also being taught in the Masters for Public Policy at Columbia University. And I've taught it in the Masters in Economic Development course on growth and governance in UCT. So it's a very flexible resource, and it lays the foundation for looking at things like inequality and institutions in a very simple way, a very accessible way, which allows you then to move into more complex issues. So I think in that sense, the challenge to us as educators, and educators in Africa, right, in our local context, to be able to tell our stories, is to adapt the material of core to our context. Because without doing that, those excellent tools that are there are going to be lost. Partly because with first years, when this kind of room and this size of room is packed with first years, it doesn't matter what you try and do to keep their attention, that attention will go if they think it's irrelevant to them in some way. If you use US dollars and not South African rands, for example. Try stuff, guys, but we all know, right? Anyone who's taught knows that that's how quickly you lose a classroom. So what we're doing at UCT is we've gotten sufficient backing after many years of trying to do this, but sufficient backing by the whole school to try and completely change our curriculum, build some local resources, local data to supplement core, introduce that into some of the teaching slides, and bring out the South African story in a far more coherent way. Okay? And in that sense, the challenge is to do this in as simple a way so that you don't alienate students with too much content, because we can also do that. We can prescribe lots and lots of supplementary readings that overwhelm students and that destroy the learning experience. The challenge of academics is to, with limited resources, make sure they get the kinds of outputs that really improve their understanding and, importantly, their intuition as an economist. Now, for me, microeconomics intuition was only ever really taught by the time you got into postgrad, right? The difference here, in my view, is that with those 5 units, first 5 units of core, you build up an approach to intuition about how economics works and how economies today look by giving students the set of tools by which they can evaluate for themselves. The ideological pluralism of core is always going to be limited because it's just one textbook, right? So, I mean, I don't think in that sense it substitutes again for a history of economics thought, for development economics thought, and in particular, if we look at the last page of, or the last couple of pages of this book, there is a tribute to Samir Amin. Now, Samir Amin, fundamentally important neo-Marxist theorist from the 1970s, came up with the whole idea of dependency theory that doesn't feature in core, right? Neither does Walter Rodney's How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Should that be in core? Perhaps not, but that's the story we need to tell in Africa. It's our stories. It's our responsibility as academics to do that, right? So it's not core's responsibility. So I think it's important
not to divorce responsibility for creating local content from academics themselves, right? We need to do those things. But what we also are challenged by CORE is to be able to teach in a new innovative way. So I think what I'm seeing now, what we're trying to use CORE and the introduction of CORE as an opportunity for at UCT is to tell the lecturers, think of it in a different way. Can we get more innovative modalities of teaching into the classroom faster? Can we engage with these debates like Bantustan, for example, and what the economic history is and why in tribal authority land in South Africa today you still get gender discrimination in access to land, you still get poor people being dispossessed by those who have tribal authority to be able to access that land or demarcate leases. Those are our stories now that we're struggling to understand. So I'm quite optimistic about the ability to do that if we introduce CORE in a well-considered way. So let me tell you my experience with implementing CORE. I piloted it in 2015 and I had to stop it in the middle of implementing it because it was bloody tough. And the students had a massive failure rate in the class I was piloting it. So when I came back to, I was off for a few years doing other creative things, and then I came back into UCT. And in UCT this year, I was told very clearly by the HOD, look, if we're going to implement this, we need a massive process to make sure everybody's on board, and we need to create a range of additional materials. And I said, we're going to need a lot more, and you're going to need to resources. So guarantee me a budget, and I'll run it. And that's what he did. So that's what we're going to try, because the language is very dense, right? And it's almost written for A-level students. So in South Africa, we have 12 years of secondary school education, not 13. That means there's a big jump when you implement CORE from that high school understanding and from first year. So you almost need to bridge that gap, because the risk is the excellent content that you find is just going to go over the heads of the student. Okay, so there's a lot of work we're doing now at UCT with a tutor group to try and allocate them to lecturers to kind of think through how can we build up our knowledge base so that we don't take too big a jump. The other thing we've done is we're slowing down the implementation of CORE. So we're only doing it, we're going to do it over 2 years. We'll start in 2019, we'll implement it for all micro and macro students, but we'll only do about 6 units in 12 weeks, which is roughly half of the pace that you would usually do. You usually go through a chapter a week. We're slowing it down to 1 chapter, 1 unit every 2 weeks, and what we're also able to do then is bring in the local content, hopefully, for each unit. So that way, at least we don't create too much additional content, but at the same time can take the core usable and intuitive parts of CORE that we want to focus on and develop that more effectively so that learning is enhanced. I think the biggest challenge with this resource is that you can get overwhelmed by it very, very rapidly. It is an app on your phone, you can do the calculus on your phone, it's all cool. Those things are all cool when you can do it, but when you're overwhelmed by not being able to solve a particular problem and you don't have the resources to solve it, then everything looks like a massive edifice and you get overwhelmed as a student, right? So we're also there to try and ensure that the way we teach this is consistent, enables and empowers our students, gets them to feel that they can do this work, they should be engaging, and they should be, in fact, extremely passionate about learning economics. I'll leave it there.
Thank you for all of your input. I imagine that there are a number of questions. If you would show your hands, let's start with the gentleman at the back. Please raise your hand. Please just wait until the mic gets to you. Let's take around of 5 or 6 questions. If you're addressing it to a particular speaker, won't you just make that plain? Otherwise, we'll share the questions equally amongst them.
Okay. Hi. Thanks. Very, very informative. Sorry, my name is Adish Badri. I'm from University of Cape Town. My question is actually across the panel. So a lot of the discussions, and Rosa just mentioned it now, and Antonio as well, around pluralism. And my question is around the core economics is still very mathematically based. It's a lot of statistical rigor. How do we balance the pluralism perspective with that mathematical rigor, especially now trying to, like you said, use it as almost a tool to decolonize economics in South Africa? How do we balance the two?
Thank you for that. There's the lady there.
Hello. Okay, my question is that you said it's for Kuma and Daniel. You said that it was used on master also, but the thing is now you want to go and give it to the first years, but most of the first years don't even have the background of economics. So this book introduces terms like, say, monetary policy and expansionary policy, but most of them in schools don't even have economics as a subject. So how do you want to apply that to the first years if most of them don't even have the background? Thank you.
Thank you for the question.
Hi, my name is Mandile. Just got a question around the economics curriculum and the role of core, but looking after the classroom. So often you'll find that those who want to protect the rigor of how economics is taught would say, look, this is maybe a requirement, this rigor, this mathematical ability is a requirement to be competitive in the workplace, or some such sort of justification. So, I don't know, I've just got then one particular question to Dr. Creamer. Could you give us some nuance as to basically the pipeline, saying once you've produced a graduate and the marketplace, and then make a comment on how core would affect that or might affect that, and then to the other panelists as well about this notion that the rigor required of a particular way we teach economics is taught in a certain way because of the pressures of what economists are to be. I hope that's all.
We take 2 more questions and then we'll get a response and go back to the floor.
I've just got a bit of 2 questions and a bit of a response as well. And the response is just that rigor and heterodox economics don't have to be like one or the other. Like, I don't know why we're creating this binary that says that if it's not neoclassical and it's not mathematical, it won't be rigorous and thorough. I think that's a false binary. I think you can be incredibly rigorous and you can be incredibly thorough, and you can still be incredibly mathematical with different schools of thought. So I just think that we need to think about it not in the sense of it's one or the other, but these things can exist at the same time. I just have a question for Kenneth. You mentioned how there's students can go in 2 directions. You can either go the neoclassical way where you study models that don't explain the real world and you can still get good marks for that, or you can go the populist way. And based on what I just said, I don't know what you mean by the populist way. What is the populist way? And can you give us an example of the populist way? And then I think all 3, or the first 2 speakers mentioned some kind of ideological position of core. And I want to know what is that ideological position? It's not clear from what you've said, and I haven't read the whole textbook, so I'm not sure what it is myself. So thanks.
Okay. Let's take 1 more. The lady at the back.
Thank you. My name is Punzile and I'm at UJ Research Institute for National Development. I just have a quick comment and a quick question. The comment is to Antonio. I think it's very important to critique core, as with anything that's new. But it's important to note that in the South African context, different schools of thought are only introduced to the curriculum and only barely at the postgrad level. I mean, we had history of economic thought at honors, and that was just one course that ran through, you know, these different economic schools of thought, and you don't actually really apply them to your, you know, to the work that you do. So, it's good as a baseline. I think core is good as a baseline to start thinking about, oh, people have thought about economics in different ways from first year, and then it can be fixed along the way. As Risa said, you know, you have teething problems, and you know, but you fix them along the way instead of throwing out the baby with the bathwater. And just a quick question to Kenneth: how are you thinking through making the South African context more salient for your pilot study? I understand that Risa and them are doing it, you know, including it all the way through. Are you doing that as well, or will we just be using case studies?
Thank you for that. To the other people who've got some questions, please just hold on to those. We'll be with you in a second. Okay. So the first question on pluralism. Not for you. Kenneth is throwing this ball in your direction.
Was it for me? Okay. Yes, correct. So I asked some people involved, was from Columbia, if they thought if core was a pluralist, and said, no, but that was not your original objective. Will you agree? So, in a sense, I think they can hear me. In a sense, we need to be clear about what we are talking about, right? Core was not designed as a pluralist course, and I understand students are asking in rethinking economics across different countries to have a pluralist perspective, not as a master thing, or as something that you do eventually if you become more interested in economics, but as a way of thinking about problems, right? The fact that you don't have a way of framing the problem. The problem of having just one way of thinking about issues since the beginning is that then you tend to get stuck with that, right? And that is something that we have been observing in many departments. By the way, core is not new. Just to inform you, there are many departments where this type of different type of teaching has been going on for many, many years. They've been labeled as heterodox departments, which by the way doesn't mean anything, because your classical economics in the beginning of the century was heterodox. Now it's mainstream, right? At that time, all the institutional economists were the mainstream, right? So it's not a matter of heterodox versus mainstream, or replacing a mainstream with another mainstream. The problem is regrounding our understanding of economics as a social science, which deals with fundamental problems, which requires different frameworks, different way of conceptualizing issues to get to the core of the problems. Use the expression. So I think pluralism, for me, pluralism is that. Right? I have many colleagues in teaching economics who are all lecturers, senior lecturers, professors in different, the majority are actually younger in different departments. We excluded the old chaps just to avoid that some Marxist was coming there. It has to be my own thing, right? We exclude this type of people, and we try to involve people who are dealing every day with the challenge of teaching. I agree with you, it's very challenging, right? Doing a real pluralist course is extremely challenging. And I think this is not what we are talking about here. We are talking about a way of making people start thinking about some of the connection that between the standard micro and some of the issues that they see in the real world. But to a certain extent, you can find some microeconomic texts that have been starting with these things already for several years, and that they've been used in different departments exactly for that reason. So I sympathize with the objective, but I don't think we are, if we set the target in terms of really saying we want to have a pluralist training in economics, I don't think we are still there for some of the reasons I mentioned. And I come just to the, you want us to address all the questions, or?
Just one of
This one, okay. Done.
Okay, so I think on that one, I think how I noted it down is that with the pluralist curriculum, do we need as much math rigor? And then, you know, partly around that is the whole question of, you know, does that fit into the context? So just on that, I mean, I think we do have to be aware that even in heterodox economics, right, there's a lot of quantitative rigor inside it. The mathematics of complex systems is increasingly being utilized in economics, and that's partly, it grew up in evolutionary biology, and then it was in evolutionary physics, and it's moving its way into economics, and that's because academics in economics come from very different backgrounds, and they'll draw tools into economics that are sometimes useful. We're finding increasing interest in this kind of evolutionary, seeing macro models as evolutionary systems models rather than macroeconometric or CD or some other type of model. So that brings us to the question in some ways also, what is it that economics graduates need to do? And if you think economics graduates need to also be able to go to a reserve bank and actually implement good policy there, then you have some very specific things they need to know, right? Similarly, if you think that economists ought to be able to evaluate policy rigorously and identify if a treatment, a policy treatment actually has an outcome that is welfare improving, you need rigor, right? So consequently, those kinds of issues will never be divorced from an economics curriculum because we're supposed to be the discipline that helps solve those questions. So I think we just need to be aware then of how the sort of graduate of an economics degree, where they go, what tools they need, and how will help us also.
Thank you for that. The second question spoke to Bridget. Kenneth, did you want to say something?
I wrote down, there were 4 questions to me.
Okay.
So I'd like to answer them together. Is that okay? Otherwise it's hard. Okay. So the 4 questions to me, I'll try and do it quickly. One was the job pipeline. And it's already been touched on very correctly here by Lisa. I see it like a tree. And we are in the trunk of the tree. And then on top of the trunk are the branches. So we're talking about the students who are at the solid beginning, and then they're going to grow in many different directions. But we must get that base very strong, and it must be more, the tools must be more historical, must be more analytical, must be from very schools before. And that's what I think. When they get up into those branches, they're going to be doing things like, I try to say to my students, some of you must go into the public service. You mustn't all just want to go work in the private sector, in the banks or Standard Bank or whatever banks are going to, and in the Reserve Bank, in the Treasury, in departments, planning health systems, health economics, whatever it might be. But if they have these tools, they'll be strong in that regard. I also think the world is changing. I mean, the 4th Industrial Revolution, we're not quite sure where people are going to be landing up and what jobs they're going to be having in the long run. So a strength in their base is very important. When I was doing law before I did economics, they used to say we trained to be philosopher kings. You know, the philosopher king of Plato who understood the good society and how it should be managed. And that was the preserve of the lawyers. And I want the economists to think like that. To think, how do we make a good society? How do we have the institutions and the laws and the processes that can achieve that kind of thing? When you come to this question of the populism and examples of the populism, I get scared when we let politics run ahead of economics. Okay, if you're going to have a loose definition of populism, where the political desire has got no economic fundamental that can sustain it. And I think that the students need to be able to argue against. So if Trump says that it's easy to win a trade war, I can just stop imports from China, and that will be good for America. You need to say, well, that's T. What happens at T+1? What happens when there's a response? And therefore, the people that you are trying to help by stopping imports from China can't export their goods into those markets. And start to debunk this kind of narrow thinking, this unclear economic thinking on the policy. Similarly, like the example I gave with monetary policy. It seems like the appearance of it is correct. You just cut interest rates. I was in a meeting the other day, and the person said, if you cut interest rates, it's good for the economy. I'll look at my bond, my bank statement, and I'll have more money because I'll pay less on my bond. It's a no-brainer. Consumption will rise, it's going to be good for everybody. But economists need to think further than that. What happens to that money that you have to account is more money. It goes from 400 rand to 600 rand. But that money is worth less because there's inflation. Okay? Do they know to think of that? Then, with the term structural interest rates, as soon as the bond market believes that there's inflation now in the system, it means that long-term interest rates are going to rise immediately. And therefore it's going to be contractionary. So economists must learn these things. They must think, oh, it appears to be, but what is the reality? And those are the dangers of populism, where you allow the intention of politics to obfuscate economic consequences. It's 2 more. Essay context. case studies, yes, I really believe that we need to reinforce the core material with South African, maybe Southern African, SACU, those kind of case studies, historical, colonial experience, apartheid experience in this core material, embedded in that material. There's this author, Ta-Nehisi Coates. He's a very important author. And they said to him, who is the Tolstoy of the Zulus? And it was an insult, meaning the Zulus don't have a Tolstoy. And he said, no, Tolstoy is the Tolstoy of the Zulus. In the sense that it's a universal knowledge we're talking about. If a Zulu person wants to appreciate Tolstoy, they read Tolstoy. But if somebody from Russia wants to read Glomo in poetry, they read Glomo. And we need to have a universalist understanding of our economic. These are many, since Smith and others, they've been working on these thoughts. And they must be applied in our context. So I think we must look at the universal knowledge and then apply it inside our context. And then the last one was teaching economics to people who just come out of school and don't know anything. Maybe that's an exaggeration.
No.
But they the challenge, I'm just teasing you. The challenge is to teach economics well, you need good teachers. And you need good materials, and you need good support. The material itself must be explained clearly, and I believe that people have the intelligence to understand within a few days what monetary policy is. They didn't know it, maybe they didn't know it before, but now they understand, oh, monetary policy, it's about management of money stock and using interest rates, and they start to understand it. You teach them after 1 or 2 lectures, maybe they have a tutorial and they're there. So I don't have a problem with that. We are teaching economics, and people have to understand that we have to find a way to get it into them. We can't say, oh, the students are not well prepared, we're not going to teach it. It's a faking condition.
Thank you for that. I'd like to give Antonio and then Riza a chance to respond to some of the other questions. I've stopped you and gone back and forth. Antonio?
There was this issue about rigor. I think you raised the point, so I'm not going to build too much into it. But let me just add one single point: is that if you, for example, look at the way in which we formalize a number of phenomena, formalization is very useful sometimes to control a number of issues and being able to frame them in a certain way. So and as you were pointing out, analytical Marxists were very, some of those, are very, eager to use behavioral economics type of thing, or you have post-Keynesians with lots of models. That's not the real problem. So all different schools have their different language and tools to be rigorous. My problem is when you have theoretical construction which are not analytically rigorous, in the sense that they do not reflect the reality of the problem they are looking at. Right? And typically, I would say, since Cobb Douglas killed us with this tremendous idea of two agronomists building up this production culture, we forgot that, for example, people have been designing fund flow models. People have been using models which are quantitative. You go back and read the American Economic Review in the early 70s by mathematician economists like Nicholas Georgescu-Roegen, who said, look, this is not the right maths to understand this problem. This was the big dilemma that Marshall had, right? He thought that biology was the right house of economics, not physics. Because biology allows you to understand, to frame or model things in a certain way. And physics, in fact, is much more rigid in that sense, right? So what I'm trying to say is that the rigor, it's not just if you use maths or not, is how you understand the problem and how you try to create heuristics, analytics to make that model providing the answers you need to get. Someone else asked about, and I've been very brief, about the position. I mean, the position is always reflecting the position of core, where core comes from, right? If I understand from people I've been talking to, but I'm always happy to be get a different perspective. Core doesn't start to say, we've been teaching economics within a very narrow paradigm, and we are now realizing that students, by the way, not those students who are the research. Or maybe, I'd like to see the statistics, right? There are lots of students who are in the real economy working with business and so on, so these people need to understand what these things are, right? We're not going to train all PhD students who are going to design all these fancy models and so we need lots of people, the 99%, who are going to work in the real economy, right? Now, when you think about what these people need, they need, from my point of view, a real pluralist perspective. Because whoever is going to set up, and could be a Marxist, could be even the so-called deterrents, is going to take that job as their job, the risk is that you always have a sort of bias. And I would say, probably the way which has been constructed should be able to integrate as much as possible, not people that work within the neoclassical framework and in the margin start doing some small improvement, information economics, Stiglitz, or things like around Beer and so on, but they also cross more boundaries which do not have to be relegated to different departments. Today, if you want to study innovation, you don't go to the Department of Economics, because people don't really do stuff there, so you go to business school, and people go to an engineering department, and people go to other places, right? This is a problem, because this is part of what we are supposed, as economists, to be able to interact with. Because as I was pointing out before, we have something specific to say about that phenomenon, if we are able to keep thinking about the phenomenon in an open way. So that's my way of responding to that second set of issues. I'll stop here.
Yeah, so I'll just respond to the question of if it's introduced that masters, what about first year? So I think those master's programs were generally interdisciplinary masters, where the people coming in don't always have economics undergrad, which is why core was used and thought to be useful there. But just on that issue, the inequality module, for example, in core, the chapter unit 10 on the financial sector, these chapters, if they're taught well, will help students right from the beginning think through issues systematically, and they're not too technical. So, for example, learning chapter 10, for the rest of your life, you'll know how to interact with the bank, how you'll interact on things like credit, on savings, and these things. So, and it was written like that by a very particular author of that unit, who's also at Columbia University and one of the world leaders in finance, because he had a specific objective that the first year students of economics must understand these aspects of finance, and wrote the chapter that way. So yes, it's rigorous, but you have that level of sort of real commitment to the question of what is core and how does it read together, despite the fact that one of my colleagues critiqued it and said it's like written as if it's written by a committee. There's no single actual thread that runs through it. I disagree. I think there's a very strong thread that goes through it, and it's rooted in the idea of behavioral economics, which is just one part of it, but nevertheless, that's a strong one. So I think that the important thing about behavioral economics, which makes it useful at first year level, is that it allows you to look at different contexts and think through what are the incentives that make this behavior happen, that lead to the society I find myself in. Doesn't matter if it's Cuba, if it's China, if it's South Africa, if it's Rwanda, if it's the United States or the UK, right? And our question really when we're teaching economics is, do we impart the tools that allow economists, graduates of economics, to be in all of the societies and actually have an informed approach to what some of the problems may be and how to solve them. And we're still a long way off that. But I think the more in which we engage in these kinds of discussions, I think the more we sort of begin to make progress towards it.
Thank you.
Just ask something. Do you think behavioral economics become a sort of new mainstream? Because you go in a department in the mainstream, because by the way, many of these things have been written by the same people who've been developing the mainstream, right? So it's a sort of schizophrenic position, if you want, right? So you go to a department of economics, let's say Cambridge, and they say, oh, now economics is just behavioral game theory. Not that. How do we solve that problem?
So I don't know, because it is, well, so let me just say, in 1948 when Samuelson published his book, it was as much of a big shift in economics, as you also said, as core is right now to the present day of it. So that as a first year, Samuelson's first year textbook then lasted for, I don't know, about 40 years, right? So it's unlikely that core will have the same shelf life. But what it is doing by bringing into account the behavioral component and taking it to first year level is forcing us to engage with what the literature in micro has really been sort of changing in the last 20 years, in my view. So that doesn't take away from all the other aspects of economics that have also been changing. So to answer the question, it might be becoming the new mainstream, and that's not necessarily a bad thing, because it depends on, for example, in my, again, that unit 5 on property and power, for me is extremely powerful. It just gives you so much more insight into understanding, almost in a historical materialist way, to use a very classical form of Marxian analysis. It gives you a very powerful set of models to understand that. So how you apply the tools of behavioral economics, whether it's in a Marxist approach, whether it's to neoclassical history. Neoclassical economics is very powerful when you look at the environment. When you think about how you've underpriced carbon for 300 years. And that's the disaster in which we live now. Neoclassical economics might be the most powerful sub-discipline of economics to explain that pricing failure. So, yes, good economists need to be able to draw from all different aspects of our spectrum of ideas and know which applications to apply which theories to. But at first, yeah, we struggle to do that.
The risk is that we start giving them we build a language, right? And our language is the language used, incentive, markets, power decline in that specific way. And the risk is that, as we know, when we teach to students, when they come to the master, even if you try to do a pluralist course, they already are pretty much framed in a certain way, and it's very difficult to go outside. Also, there is an element of commitment, right? So you learn certain tools. It's difficult to move aside from those tools, right? David Minkowski wrote beautiful things about this, right? So it's a very problematic issue because I think modern history is a problem. So I think we really need to take, from my perspective, pluralism as an entry point into this discussion, because the risk is that, like Samuelson, we have to review the textbook because we realize that lots of things we write there are wrong or inconsistent.
Thank you for letting us in on that. So I'm going to take 4 more questions and then limit the response to 90 seconds of your best input. There was a gentleman down there, the lady in black over there, lady up at the top, and then the gentleman just in front.
So my name is Matthew. I also teach economics. I've listened to Reza and Kenneth a couple of times. We've communicated. I've also listened to Antonio's critique. I share some of the perspective Antonio raises, particularly if you look at how core emerged, the motivation for the emergence of core, the fact that what we had in the curriculum was not speaking to the problems that the Western world is facing as far as the financial crisis is concerned. That is great. I think there is some value in core. If we put that against what we have now in the curriculum in South Africa and other parts of the continent, there is some value. But I also think that that value can be enhanced much better if we put in a little bit more effort in generating the case studies and adaptation and all that. UCT, VITS, we're doing something. I think it would be helpful if we can have a critical mass of varsities or departments that are able to provide resources so that adaptation and the critique that is coming from Antonio can be addressed more meaningfully. But I think as individual departments, it can be overwhelming, to try to deal with that, because it's going to require a lot of resources and effort to structure it in a way that it speaks to the new experiences of African economies. And our challenges are very different as compared to those in Asia, Latin America, and all that. And that needs to be reflected in this new curriculum. That's it.
Thank you. Okay. The lady at the end of that row.
Hi everyone. My name is Nakifa. I teach and learn economics at various levels at the University of Johannesburg. My question is directed to all 3 of the panel members. At many universities in South Africa, you have thousands of students learning economics as a first major and then as a second or third major. So my question is first major, you need to learn it differently, as opposed to when you learn it as a second or third major. And then there are other people who believe that if economics is economics, doesn't matter. I don't know if I'm making sense, but does it matter if it's your major? Should it be taught differently if it's your major, or should it be taught differently to accountants, lawyers, and so on? Thank you.
Thank you. The lady right at the back with the doctor. Happy. Okay. The gentleman there, 2 rows in front of her, and let's take the gentleman at the back too.
So thanks, Liz. So I also teach economics both here and have done in the UK. So I came here without any particular view on core at all. I was just interested to hear what people had to say, to learn about it, and really to think about the resources which are available. So I've got a question about that and then a comment. So the question is, Antonio, it's probably to you more than anybody else. You've offered a very, in fact, can I just shout?
It's much better, yeah.
So you've offered a very compelling critique of core, which is great. But then I listened to Reza as well, and I really like the way that he laid out what it can do, particularly pedagogically. And in fact, there was rigor in action, demarcating what it can and what it can't do and what its limits are. So my question to you, Antonio, is if there are that many problems in core, right, in terms of the way that it's actually conceptualized, what actually are the alternative resources which are available to core that we can use in constructing an economics program which is generally pluralist right from the word go? And by pluralist here, I don't just mean in terms of actually having a genuine understanding of the historical context of the emergence of ideas and their reproduction, their transmission, which I agree with you, but also which recognises that they actually represent different kinds of social standpoints on questions as well, and actually are genuinely ideological, and actually there are limits in how one can pick and mix ideas. So what are the resources for teaching that if core is not up to the task? The second point was just a comment, really, and it comes back to something Kenneth said, which I think is absolutely right, which is about the way in which, of course, it's up to us here teaching within South Africa. Reza made the same point, in that we need to bring in the examples which have relevance to teaching economics here. But I'd just like to say that's a real gift, not just to South Africa, but it's also a gift to the global north as well. Because if economics is really going to be understood as a discipline whose objective engagement is capitalism, then capitalism is, of course, simultaneously global, but also globally variegated. And if you're not able to understand those variegations as you teach it in the north, then you're not actually teaching economics either. So whatever is done here to develop examples which are relevant to the situation here, which are relevant to the situation in China and Brazil, that actually I want people to understand as a gift to those of us who want to teach economics in the north as well. So it's decolonising economics is something which all of us need to be doing wherever we are.
Thank you.
I thank you for a fascinating discussion. I'm really inspired by it. My name is Alroy Paulus. I work for Pekano, Atlantic Fellows for Health Equity South Africa. We're one of the 7 global Atlantic Fellows programs. Reza, you said something that was a balm to my soul, because we ran our first cohort of a fellows program with 35 people from all backgrounds, from not having a matric to being a PhD candidate. And a very diverse group of people had to be passionate about social and economic justice linked to health equity. Health equity, not health services equity, so it can be any determinant of health. It is being externally and internally evaluated. And I think my question to you would be, how did you come to the conclusion that you're going to give yourselves more time? Because we learned the hard way that starting something with such uniqueness would obviously lead to some confusion, some contestation, but I get the idea perfectly with core in that when you are in the room to discuss economics or health equity, like I've been in the Treasury lockup, the 45 people in the room until 10 years ago were exclusively economists from the private sector, mostly banks. Only the last
7 or 8 years, unions, Kusaki in particular, when I worked for the Black Sash, I was asked to be civil society representative, were in that room. And there you had, what I mentioned in an earlier session, a sense of cognitive dissonance. You're torn between engaging the language and simplifying it and waiting to know how do you say that to your constituency in simple English in a 1-minute clip on SAFM. I think economists need to begin talking the ordinary languages of ordinary people first. And that dilemma needs to be challenged and grown. I'd like to know, Rifa, what did it take for everybody to realize in your organization that you needed more time? Because I think that's the noble mistake we made. Now we know better in my organization. But it's very important to give yourself some more time because it's highly ambitious, but important.
Thank you. I'm going to ask for 90 seconds in response, starting with Kenneth, and then Antonia, and then Teresa. If you've got some burning questions, please engage with the speakers at lunch. I have 20 questions after this session. Kenneth.
So 90 seconds starting now.
Yes.
I agree with so much. 80 seconds starting now. Yeah, I think we should collaborate. We need to collaborate. In fact, meeting each other in this room is very helpful for that collaboration. There's other universities involved, UP, Stellenbosch, ourselves, UT. We should really do that because many hands make light work, and it's important work. The reality of implementing these things in our academia, in our universities, is really hard. You're dealing with so many problems. So like, should it be for all of first year? Should it be for part of first year? In the end, you'll end up making compromises which might not be good in theory, but there's a way to go forward in practice. At least rather than the whole, that that's how it should be. They're doing it for the whole. You're doing it for the whole of your first year. Wits is doing it for a group. It's not all thought through. It's just practically. You're up against all kinds of realities and resistance. And it's, just the inertia. People don't want to change. People don't like change. They're not sure. Is this the right way, the wrong way? But we must just have this cohort of people who are committed. Commitment's very important.
I think I went way to more or less address all of them, pointing to what you were saying. Well, I agree with your first point, right? We need to build alternatives, right? And I think one of the way would be also to learn from economics department, who over many years have tried, with failure and success, to teach the micro in a different way. And I think
one chapter per week, and Wendy just said to me that was just too fast. So, it's also about the feedback, and we did an external review, which was also a language review. So the big scary thing for us is also that the language is really dead. And then we were thinking, how do we do this? They talk of Pareto efficiency already in Unit 2, So you really do have very real constraints inside of core, which you have to be able to deal with, and you can only do that with time. And then the last thing on that is just, with respect to implementing slowly, the question is to bring in local content to help with the digestion of the material. So I think that's how we're hoping to mitigate the risks of the experience of last time.
Thank you so much. I'm loath to stop, but we are 15 minutes into lunch, so you're going to have to eat quickly. So my apologies for going over. Thank you very much.